Hello and welcome back to the free online woodworking school. In the last episode, we got these mortises cut, and so in this one, we're going to start doing the tenons. Now for these tenons, they're about 4 inches wide, 100 millimeters or so, and so you're going to need something a little bit coarser than a dovetail saw to cut these. Personally, I'd recommend getting something like a Ryoba, which has got a rip cut and a cross cut pattern on one side, or you could just go for a traditional Western style push saw, but make sure it's got a rip tooth on it. We're going to be cutting with the grain here, and we've got quite a big distance to cover, and so if you're trying to do that with a saw that's filed to a cross cut pattern, it will work, but it's just going to be really slow, and it's also going to wear down the teeth prematurely. So make sure you've got a saw with a rip tooth pattern on it, and preferably something around the kind of 10 TPI mark. It could be 8, it could be 11. I think this is 11. You want it to be slightly coarser than a dovetail saw that usually sits around about a 14 or a 16 TPI. And just for terminology, TPI is teeth per inch. Sometimes it's PPI, points per inch. It's pretty much the same thing. The lower the number, the coarser the saw, the finer the number, the higher the number, the finer the saw. And so when you're doing this, rip tooth pattern, preferably somewhere around the 10 TPI mark, or get yourself a Japanese Ryoba saw that's got a rip tooth on one side, which is usually the kind of TPI you want for something like this, and it also has a cross cut on the other side, which will also come in useful for this. So when we're cutting tenons, one thing to remember is we've got 3 lines that we need to hit. We've got the one along the top, and we've got the one down the back and the front. If you start the saw like this, you're going to find it quite difficult, because not only have you got to hit all 3 lines at once, but also you can't really see what's going on down the back here. And there is a slight bit of flex on saw plates, so even if you're hitting the one down the front here that you can see, it doesn't always do what you want on the back here, regardless of how good you are with the saw. So what I personally like to do here is tilt the piece forward like this and focus primarily on establishing this line here. We will inevitably start following this top line as well, but at least we can see what's going on with it. And we're going to focus on this one on the back later. I'm going to get my thumb on the corner and start with the saw just next to the line on the waist side. With tenons, I don't like to cut to the line. I like to work back to them with a chisel. And then very carefully, we're just going to start the saw, really light pressure. So there we go, I'm probably about 1 millimeter away there. That's a really nice starting point for now. So we'll keep going and work our way down to the shoulder line that I can see on this face, while also just making sure that I am still in the waist here. If I have the saw off at an angle like this, then I could still be tracking the one down the front, but cutting into the tenon on the top, so we don't be wanting that. Okay, down to the line there. We'll do this other side. Okay, so there is one side done. Next, I'm going to move this to be slightly more upright so that I can work my way along this line on the top. Again, just keeping an eye on the shoulder line here to make sure we don't go too deep. Oh, hang on a sec. I've just realized I've only cut down to the haunch. I actually need to keep going because this whole area on the side is going to be removed. Just that little square in the middle is going to be what remains. Honestly, I'm a little bit out of practice with cutting tenons, so we'll see how this turns out. I'm probably just going to work my way down to the shoulder line while it's in this position in the vise. There's no reason why not. Okay, and now with the line established down both faces, we can go in from the top, place the saw in that line that we've established. It might be a little bit bindy to begin with, so you might have to just work it back and forth. That's just because the area in the middle might not be perfectly meeting. Get it started, and now just long strokes. Use all of the teeth on the saw. You bought all of them, so you might as well use them. Just check your progress as you go. So that's the lines down the faces, down the end grain, and down the other face, all perfect. And of course at this stage you might be tempted just to cut those off, but think ahead here. If you do that, you then lose all of the markings that we did in part 1 of this series, and you're just going to have to remark them out on the tenon again, and it's not going to be as accurate. So before cutting these faces off, we're going to cut these lines as well. And so for this, I am going to use a dovetail saw. What we're cutting is relatively thin, so it shouldn't end up clogging the teeth on this too much. And I'm going to cut straight to these lines. There's no point leaving stuff we have to chisel here, because as soon as we cut these cheeks off, we're not going to have a line to chisel back to. We might as well just cut straight to the line. Of course, making sure to keep it on the waist side. See, that one went a little bit off course because I didn't actually clamp it square in the vise because I had the camera in the way, ruining my perspective. But this really doesn't matter too much. Of course, it'd be better if it was 90 degrees, but it's all going to be hidden in the mortise anyway. But I just wanted to show this to you because you don't have to stress too much if things like this happen with mortise and tenons. That's why these joints can be so forgiving. Next, we'll do the haunch. Again, cutting directly to that line. And then turn it sideways and cut that material off. In this case, you don't necessarily have to cut to the line because this little square section on the top is going to be visible when the joint's assembled. I mean, it won't when the table's made, but if this was going to be an exposed joint, then you could always chisel back to that line on the top to make sure it's nice and square. I'm just going to cut straight to it in this case. Okay, then we can also cut this little bottom bit off. I am going to leave a little bit to chisel back to here. So there you go, you can see there's a bit of the shoulder line left over there for me to clean up with a chisel. And now we can cut the cheeks off. I'm going to see if I can get this in my vise and do it. If this isn't possible with you, you could just clamp it down to the bench. But that looks like it's going to work. And again, here we want to leave roughly 1 millimeter or so to chisel back to. And as is always the case when I'm doing long cuts like this, I like to start on one end and just lower the saw to track it from back to front. So I'll just work my way through the rest of them and then we'll get cleaning them up afterwards. Okay, so the tenons are all rough cut. The next thing we're going to do is chop down to the shoulder lines rather than start paring down these faces to fit the mortises. Let me explain why. So we've got about 1 millimeter we need to pare off of these faces. Oosh, that never happened. We've got about 1 millimeter we need to pare off of these faces with a chisel or a shoulder plane or whatever, but let's say it's a chisel for now. The problem with doing this is that the fibers we're removing are technically still attached to the end grain here. And so it's going to make it quite difficult to get into that corner because the fibers are basically going to be pinching on the edge of that chisel. So what makes more sense here is to actually chisel down this shoulder line first. And once we bottom out, just give it one more tap, which is going to cut the fibers along the tenon. So then when it comes to pairing across here, they just peel up effortlessly. This is such a minor process change, but just swapping those two things around makes such a difference when paring back grain like this. It's actually a similar kind of process to what we did in the last episode when we were cutting the haunches. We kind of established the end grain first before chopping out the bulk of the waste in the haunch, and then that way we were less kind of restricted by what the grain wanted to do and the directions it wanted to go and all that. We kind of established the area we wanted to remove, and then it just made the rest of it much easier and also much more accurate. So when you're doing things like this, think about the grain you're going to be removing and then ask yourself, is there any areas where I can kind of sever that grain or pre-cut it in order to make the bit I want to remove easier to remove. And when cutting long distances like this, always use as big of a chisel as you can get. That's going to give you the straightest line and with very minimal choppiness on it. You could also do it with a shoulder plane if you want, but I actually just like chiseling back to them. One of the most common things I see with this is people using smaller chisels in order to do this because it's easier to chop through the end grain. Well, of course it is. You're removing less material, and so powering this through is going to be much easier than getting something like this through. That said, if you're struggling to remove material with something like this, there's one of two reasons why. First one, you're either taking off too much material on the end grain and you need to remove the bulk of the waste before chopping into the line, or secondly, it's blunt. Other than that, there is no excuses and they're both down to you. So here, for example, I've got about 1 millimeter of material to remove, which certainly could be done with this wide chisel. But actually, I kind of want to get a bit closer to the baseline before doing that final chop, because if we've got too much material on this side of the line, as we chop down, it's going to start wanting to push the chisel below the line, and that's what's going to give us the kind of choppiness. And so this is where using a smaller chisel is quite helpful, because you can use this to remove the bulk of the waste, because firstly, it's easier to chop down and remove a fair amount at once. Not that we need to do it here, but you can remove a fair bit with this. But secondly, it also preserves the sharpness of your main chisel, which you're going to be chopping back to the line with. So in action, it looks like this. We get the small chisel first and we go along and just try and half that material that's remaining. We're not chopping in the line here. Okay, and then we can just carefully go along and break them off. And now we're super close to that line, so we can get the wide chisel, place it in there and hit all the way down to the tenon. And that gives us a perfectly straight shoulder line, no choppiness whatsoever, and so should give us a really nice join into the leg. We'll do the same on the other side. Remove the bulk of the waste with a smaller chisel. Switch to the large one. The other thing I'm doing here is when chopping down this shoulder line, I'm sighting along it. So very similar to the mortise in the last episode. Keep calling them episodes, parts. I can very easily see if I'm chopping 90 degrees to the face. If I was looking from this direction, let's use this component as an example, put that in the shoulder line, you can't actually see if you're cutting 90 degrees or not. And so you might end up with too much of an undercut, or you're going to end up with a sort of ridge that you're going to need to pare back later. And this is a pretty minor detail, but I might as well explain it. The hand in which you hold a chisel with when sighting along like this does matter to some extent, or at least I find that to be the case. Personally, I hold it with my hand off the workpiece. So because I'm left-handed, the piece is sort of on the right hand side. That means when I'm chopping down, I can see this 90-degree edge here, because the base of the chisel is going to be what creates that 90-degree face. Whereas, let me just move the clamp. If I were right-handed, for example, and I was holding it like this, firstly, I can't see the back of the chisel that well that's creating that 90-degree edge. And secondly, the taper on this chisel is probably going to give me a false idea of what 90 degrees actually is. Like if I'm basing this on the taper, it's going to be around there. But if I move my hand, you can see it's angled in. So this is such a minor thing, I know, but if you're left-handed like me, have the piece on the right-hand side, and so your hand will be floating off the piece like this. Or if you're right-handed with a chisel, have the piece off to the left, and then you can still see that 90-degree edge, rather than working with the chisel on your right hand and also the piece on your right hand as well, where you're going to sort of be hiding everything. It's very minor, I know, but every time I explain to someone to look down the line, there is always this kind of like bedding in process where they're like figuring out what hand is best. For me, that tends to be the case. Just give it a go with both hands and see what works. And then finally, we've got this little area on the bottom of the tenon here. When cutting this, I prefer to kind of angle the chisel up. So I'll get myself into the shoulder line, angle it up, and then basically just pare away that material until we get flush with the shoulders surrounding it. This mitigates any kind of possibility of starting in the line like that, accidentally angling up too much and digging down into the shoulder lines that we'll see on the faces here. If you start by angling up, you can just carefully peel away the grain until you're kind of flush with the surrounding end grain, which is about there. Slightly catching it on this side here, but I think we got away with that. So the shoulder lines are now all done, and a byproduct of that is that we've chopped slightly into the tenon. Not so much that it's affected the strength of the tenon, but just enough to sever those fibers, like I was saying before. And so now, when we pare across like this, those fibers just very easily separate. We're not trying to remove fibers that are still attached to this kind of section here. So personally, this is how I like to pare back to tenons. Firstly, put your chisel in the end grain, and we're just going to give it a couple of taps all the way around just to separate those fibers, but without fully breaking them off. Because if we go too mental with this, we're going to split it all the way down and the grain's just going to follow whatever direction it wants. We're just looking to separate it here. Then just break them off, shouldn't take much. And what you're left with is two lines. We'll pare this side with a chisel. I'll just pare that off. Pare this side off. Just kind of get down to that bit we separated. And now just test it. You can see I'm starting this with A. I'm going to do this systematically just so I can keep track of things. So it goes in pretty easily at the start and then it binds, which is fine. So if we take that out now, you can sort of see some shiny spots all along here. Those are the areas we need to remove. Definitely got some on the back here as well. You can see a fair bit there. And to be honest, it's all the way over, but mostly in those areas and definitely all over this bit. So it's just a case of flattening across that tenon, remove those shiny spots and make sure to remove from both sides simultaneously. You don't want to be doing it all on one face or else you're going to end up completely misaligned. Just make sure to check it often. That's pretty good already. And it's looking like the haunch might be restricting things now. But I can see a few shiny spots on the tenon too. Might be able to see those two patches there and there. Those can be carefully removed. Definitely the haunch now. So you might be able to see it's just slightly twisted in there. I might be able to force that by hand, but I think I'll probably just take a little bit off the top of the haunch here on the tenon, and that should allow me to get it in there. I've still got a bit of the line to get back to here anyway, so. Oh, it's just about going. Okay, well it's going in pretty straight. Let's see where that's rubbing now. Definitely got a bit more on the haunch here. So it just snugs up at the bottom there. Still holds really nicely, but also we're not having to like whack it in there. And so glue should do the rest of that. However, it's still not quite bottoming out. And I've got a feeling it's on the tenon that it's not doing it. So yeah, looking at the end grain of this, there is a real telltale sign right on the edge there. That kind of light area that's shiny, that's showing me it's hitting something in the bottom of the mortise. And so we can either take it off the tenon, or if I look in the mortise and I brighten this right up, you can probably see that step in the back corner there. Completely missed that when I was checking it. So we'll get that out now. Now remember, we don't really want to be levering against here. Going from this direction. Feeling optimistic about this. Looks pretty good. There is, however, a very small gap up the shoulder line, but also, more importantly, you can see the leg is sitting proud, which we absolutely don't want in this case. And I can see exactly why this is. It's because the top of the haunch is like angled up slightly, even though I've got a line on the end, which actually there is still a little bit of it left. The inside of the mortise is kind of bottoming out up here. So I'll just flatten that bit out. And so that has instantly allowed the tenon to shift up slightly, and we're now perfectly flush on the top. You can't even feel that. But as for this gap on the shoulder line here, there's a few things that could be causing that. So let's just tick them off one by one. The first one would be that this rail is off at an angle compared to the leg. And so what we would expect to see from that is a gap down one side, but it would be closed on the other. However, with this, when I push it shut, there is a consistent gap on both sides. And also just visually looking at it, I can see that that's sitting absolutely fine at the moment. So we know that it's sitting straight and there's a consistent gap, which leads us to diagnosis 2, which is the shoulder lines not being square. Now, if this is the case, when this goes into the leg, it's going to bottom out on the inside corner of this tenon rather than this outside corner that we can see when it's assembled. So you can't really test this with a ruler, it's just here for demonstration. So what you can do here is, with a very small adjustable square, you can go along and you can check the shoulder to see if the square is touching the inside corner before it's touching the outside. If it touches the outside first, then you can see a little bit of light on the inside here. That's not a huge issue. That's called an undercut. And so it's looking pretty good along here. It's all 90 degrees. But right at the end here, you might be able to see, can you see it on the camera? Yes. You see it's touching that inside face before it's touching the outside one. I can even kind of tip the square to match it. And so that little bit along here could be restricting the outside from bottoming out. So I'll just come in with a chisel and get rid of that. However, even with that fix, the gap is still there, which is to be expected. The gap was a little bit bigger than what that error would have created, which brings us to the third cause, which is simply the tenon or the haunch is still bottoming out. And I suspect that it's the haunch. You can kind of just feel it. If you push it on the top of the tenon, a lot of the times you'll kind of feel the area where it's sort of more solid. And for me, it's the haunch. So we'll just pare a little bit off that. Much easier to do it there than it is inside the mortise, although that is a bit scraggly in there. This is the one where the grain dove down a bit, but we'll just flatten this out and see where that leaves us. I think that'll be enough. The other thing you can also do is just put a few chamfers on the end of the tenon, and that way no fluff in the corner of the mortises is going to prevent it from bottoming out. And so, if all has gone to plan, just get it flush with the top of the leg. Seamless, that is what we like. So yeah, when it comes to gluing, just a tiny bit of pressure from the clamps should close up any remainder of that gap. And so now we've got the remaining five to do. And remember, do it systematically. Much easier to keep track of then, and you can just tick them off as you go. I was just looking for B, of course it's attached to A. Okay, so both frames are together. Of course, we can't get the back rail in yet because the back rail shares a mortise with the side rails. And so the next step is to simply put a mitre on the end of the tenons, making sure we mitre the correct side. So all I'm going to do is just get in there with a pencil, mark where that shoulder line's going to be, and just scribble out all the rest of it. And we can take them out, reinsert the back rail, and just do the same thing. And then you can cut this back however you best see fit. You could just do it with a chisel going along like that, a shoulder plane, whatever. I'm going to do it with my block plane. Doesn't need to be too accurate, of course. We just need them to be able to share that mortise. Okay, so there is a slight twist on this, and while I think some of that might be down to my bench, I can see that this leg is kind of out slightly, so I don't think that's going to be helping much. And looking on this front step here, the kind of top of it is about 8mm, whereas down here it's sort of closer to 7. So either the mortise or the tenon is slightly twisted here, and so we're going to look at the two and most likely adjust the tenon in order to sort of swing the bottom round slightly, or just checking the other ones. No, it looks like the inside actually needs to be 7, so we're actually looking to bring the top around like this. Yeah, that makes sense because the outside is 4. So I'll just put an arrow on the end here, and then I know it's that side of the haunch that we're going to be removing. Just going to cut the fibres along the top here to make these kind of cross grain fibres easier to remove. And see how they just peel straight off? That's because we just severed the fibres. And then seeing as we've taken some off the top corner here, I'm also going to remove a very small amount on the bottom corner, because actually there's a lot of rubbing marks here. This will just help give a bit of clearance for that top to come around. Okay, and now here is another culprit. So if we sight along the back leg, you can see it just starts sticking out beyond that front one. Now I'm pretty sure a lot of this could be corrected once I get the front rails in. But let me just visually show you what's happening here. So effectively, the frames are doing this, and what that gives you is a low point on each opposite corner. And so the fact this is kind of rocking all over the place is, you know, pretty inevitable. So we're going to do the same thing to that back leg and see what we can do about that slightly twisted tenon. So again, 5mm there, 4mm here. So the 5mm section is correct. This means the bottom needs to swing around now. So let's just give the mortise a visual check. I mean, that's one of the best ones I cut, I reckon. So it's got to be the tenon. So if the bottom needs to swing around, we need to remove down here and perhaps a little bit up here as well, just to give it a bit of clearance, but not too much. So even though we adjusted that a fair amount, we've still got a pretty good bite on it. In fact, that's actually about the sort of tightness you want on joints like this. They should just be able to go in and close up with and just like that, while in the middle of bragging about how good my joints were, my microphone died. So we'll end this video here. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to press the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.